I'm Mara Linwood, 33 years old, and I used to believe that love within a family was something you never had to earn when my grandfather passed away. My father looked me straight in the eye and told me I was no longer of any use to him. I'd spent the last year caring for the man who raised me, and in less than 5 minutes, my entire life unraveled. I didn't cry. Not then. Not in front of him. Instead, I picked up the journal my grandfather gave me and walked out without a word. What neither of us knew was that he'd made one final decision that would change everything before the week was over. Before I tell you the rest, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to start over when someone you trusted let you down. I was raised in a house where silence often meant more than words. My mom died of ovarian cancer when I was 8 years old, and my father, David, never really came back from that loss. Not in the expect he didn't drink or disappear, he just turned off. It was my grandfather, Henry, who stepped in and filled the space with quiet consistency. He moved me into his home in a small town outside Providence, Rhode Island, where every floorboard creaked and the windows whistled in the winter. And somehow, it all felt safe. He was the kind of man who worked with his hands even when he didn't have to, and who taught me early on that you can tell everything you need to know about someone by how they treat people who can't give them anything in return. Growing up under Henry's roof meant early mornings pancakes from scratch and long evenings in the garage, where he showed me how to fix things that didn't seem broken. He never bragged about what he built, but everyone in town knew him. He started Linwood Construction with a single truck and a loan he paid back in 3 years. By the time I was in high school, his name was on half the buildings in town, but you wouldn't know it by looking at him. He still drove a dented Chevy and bought his jeans from the hardware store. He taught me that character wasn't something you talked about. It was something you proved one decision at a time. My father never quite understood that the only child of a self-made man, he spent more time calculating what the business was worth than learning how to run it. He had a degree in economics and a wardrobe full of tailored suits, but no patience for people. I remember sitting on the porch with Grandpa one evening when he said, "Dave has a good mind but no feel for the work. He sees numbers, not names." I didn't know what that meant back then, but I felt it every time my dad passed through town without staying the night or sent birthday cards with gift cards inside and no personal note. I stopped expecting him to show up and stopped hurting when he didn't. When it came time for college, I chose business like him, hoping it might be a way to reach him. I even picked the same university he'd attended, thinking maybe it would start a new chapter, but he only said it was a practical decision that should lead to decent income. No congratulations, no smile, just an assessment, like I was a stock report. My grandfather, on the other hand, took me out to dinner that night at a little Italian place where they knew our names. He gave me a leather-bound planner and told me something I've never forgotten. Pay attention to how people behave when they think no one's watching. I built my career in marketing after graduation. Remote work mostly for mid-sized firms, which let me stay close to home as Henry got older over time. His strong frame softened. His steps grew slower, and he needed more help with everyday things. I didn't hesitate when the doctor said, "Heart failure, he needed care," and I had the flexibility to give it. So I moved back into that old house with the creaky floors and peeling shutters and turned it into a place of quiet routines again. And that's when David started showing up more often. The visits started coming, every weekend like clockwork. My father, who used to stop by only when he needed to discuss business with Grandpa Henry, now showed up in polished shoes, carrying bottles of wine and talking just a little too loud. He'd sit in the living room asking Henry questions that seemed warm on the surface, how he was feeling, how the roses were doing, but they always drifted back toward the company. What contracts were active, who was running operations, whether any changes had been made to the estate planning. At first, I thought maybe he was trying to reconnect, but Henry noticed it too. One afternoon after David had left with his usual tight handshake and empty smile, Henry reached over from his recliner and put his hand on mine. "You know, Mara," he said, eyes steady but tired, "people always tell you who they are. You just have to stop making excuses for them." He didn't say it with anger, just clarity. He knew what his son was doing, what he'd always done, but there was no need to spell it out. When Henry's doctor gave us the final prognosis, I sat beside him in a white-walled consultation room that smelled faintly of alcohol wipes and floor polish. The cardiologist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Patel, said the words carefully, 6 months, maybe less. Grandpa listened quietly, then just nodded once. "Well," he said, folding his hands together, "we'd better make good use of what's left." That same night, I packed up my apartment for good and moved fully back into the house. My desk fit snug in the corner of the den, close enough to hear if he needed anything. Most days, I worked when I could and cared for him when I had to. It wasn't glamorous organizing meds, measuring blood pressure, trying to cook meals he might actually feel like eating, but it felt like the right way to spend whatever time we had left. Lydia, a home nurse from town, stopped by 3 days a week, but the day-to-day was mine. I didn't resent it. We had a rhythm. On the good days, we'd sit out in the backyard, and he'd point out which rose bushes needed trimming. On the bad days, we'd sit in silence, the oxygen machine hissing gently beside us. David's visits became more frequent, twice a week now, and each time he brought takeout, Henry could barely eat. Expensive stuff, steakhouse dinners, imported pastries, bottles with unpronounceable labels. He'd show up asking about the Jefferson contract or where certain deeds were filed. I would be folding laundry in the next room, listening to him pretend that these were just casual conversations. Grandpa would nod along, but sometimes I'd see him glance toward me when David asked about asset transfers or business valuations. It was subtle, but I saw it. He knew. Then one afternoon, just after another one of David's visits, Henry asked me to help him to his study. The room hadn't changed in decades. Oak shelves packed with books, a roll-top desk with brass handles, an old clock that chimed every hour just a little off. He sat down carefully and said, "Call Harold Jenkins for me. It's time we looked over some things." Harold had been Grandpa's attorney since before I was born. He came by the next day carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a gray wool coat despite the mild weather. The two of them disappeared behind the study door for almost 3 hours. I stayed in the hallway, folding a clean throw blanket and trying not to think too hard. When Harold finally came out, he rested his hand on my shoulder and said, "Your grandfather's always been a careful man. That hasn't changed." He declined my offer of coffee and left without another word. That night, after I'd helped Henry to bed, he motioned for me to sit. "Promise me something," he said, his voice thin but firm. "Live by your own compass, not anyone else's." I told him I would. He smiled faintly. "And don't worry about what comes next. I've made sure you'll be all right." I thought he meant emotionally, spiritually. I didn't realize not then just how literally he'd meant it. In those final weeks, David began showing up almost daily. He brought paperwork, now manila folders and stapled reports, which he'd spread out on the dining room table like it was an office. He told me that Dad needs to stay connected to the work, but the doctors had said clearly that stress would only make things worse. Still, he kept pushing. And Henry, though tired, didn't stop him. He just watched. I'd catch snippets of conversations through half-open doors. Harold came back twice more each time, quiet and focused. Once I overheard Grandpa say, "He needs to learn. This is the only way." He never explained what that meant. I didn't ask. The final decline came quicker than we expected. Within days, Henry couldn't get out of bed. The oxygen tank became constant. His voice grew faint sometimes, just a whisper. I moved a cot into the room and stayed close. David came by each morning now, offering to take care of things so I could get some rest, but I never left the room. On a Monday evening in October, the house was quiet. David had stepped outside to take a call. Henry opened his eyes and reached for my hand. "Remember who you are, Mara," he said. "Blood doesn't make someone family. Not always." He squeezed my hand once. "The truth shows up when it needs to." He fell asleep soon after, and sometime before dawn, while I was still holding his hand and telling him about the sunrise, he slipped away. The nurse came first, then the doctor. I made the necessary calls. When I reached my father, he picked up on the second ring. His voice was rough from sleep, but it sharpened fast when I told him. "Don't call anyone else," he said. "I'll be right there." He showed up less than an hour later, already dressed in a navy suit, no tie. He barely glanced at Henry before he started opening drawers, flipping through folders, checking bookshelves like something might have moved overnight. "What are you doing?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Dad said he kept a copy of the will here." I stood there next to the bed, still wearing the sweater I'd slept in, and watched my father make calls to the funeral home and the company board one after the other like he was ticking off boxes. There was no room for mourning in his tone, just business. The funeral came quickly. A gray sky hung low that morning, and the wind picked up just enough to rattle the leaves but not blow them free. The church was full employees, clients, neighbors, friends. People stood along the back wall, hats in hand. I wore the same black dress Grandpa once called understated and perfect. When it was David's turn to speak, he focused on Henry's accomplishments. His words were polished and distant, heavy with industry terms and buzzwords, nothing about Sunday mornings or roses or Steinbeck in the evenings. When I stood at the podium, I didn't prepare anything. I just told them what Henry had taught me, that character matters more than title, that a quiet room full of warmth is better than a loud one full of ambition. I didn't look at my father once. After the service, a man I didn't recognize approached me in the reception line. He had silver hair, a tan coat, and a steady voice. A beautiful service, he said, offering his hand. It was Harold Jenkins. "Your grandfather would have been proud." He handed me a card. "There will be a reading of the will tomorrow at 2:00. At the house. Please don't be late." David must have overheard because he stepped up behind me. "I've cleared my schedule," he said. "Will the company transfer papers be ready?" Harold gave a polite nod, but didn't answer. His voice when he spoke again was cool and professional. "All necessary documents will be presented." He turned back to me and added, "Just be on time." By the end of the night, the house had emptied. The silence felt heavier than usual. I was rinsing glasses in the kitchen sink when David stepped into the doorway. "You should pack tonight," he said casually, like he was suggesting I beat the morning traffic. "After the will reading tomorrow, I'll be moving in. The house is tied to the company, and the company is mine now." I stood still, hands dripping water running. "This is my home," I said. David didn't flinch. "It belonged to your grandfather, which means it passes to me." Upstairs, the bedroom lights glowed warm against the hallway walls. The house felt more like memory than place. I didn't sleep much that night, and when I did, I dreamed of roses without color and doors without keys. The next day, I sat in the study waiting for what came next. The study was already full when I walked in. My father had taken the seat behind Grandpa's desk, leaning back like he'd already made himself comfortable. A few company board members were there, along with Henry's longtime financial advisor, a soft-spoken man named Rick Mahoney. Harold Jenkins stood near the window, quietly, sorting through a thick stack of papers he'd brought in a leather briefcase. I found a chair near the edge of the room and sat without speaking. No one made eye contact with me. Harold cleared his throat and opened the folder in front of him. "This is the last will and testament of Henry Leland Linwood," he said. "Witnessed and notarized and on file with the state." The room fell silent. The first sections were routine arrangements for the funeral charitable gifts, specific items set aside for longtime staff. Then he reached the part everyone was waiting for. To my son David, Richard Linwood Harold read, I leave full ownership of Linwood Construction and all related business holdings, including the family home and estate assets, currently valued at approximately $56 million. My father didn't move, but I saw his lips press together slightly. The board members shifted in their seats. One offered a quiet congratulations that hung awkwardly in the air. My hands were folded in my lap, but my nails pressed into my palms. Harold kept reading more small provisions, minor accounts trust language I didn't fully understand, but my name never came up, not once. When the reading ended, there was a soft rustle as chairs pushed back and papers were shuffled. David stayed seated, smiling faintly now. Looks like we've got clarity, he said to no one in particular. He didn't even glance my way. I stood up and walked over to Harold. Was that everything I asked, keeping my voice level? Before he could answer, my father spoke up. You heard it, he said. The house, the company, it's all mine now. You'll need to have your things out by morning. Contractors start Monday. His tone was calm, like he was explaining a shipping schedule or a room reservation. Harold didn't speak, just handed him a printed summary of the will and closed his folder. I stayed where I was for a moment, trying to take in the scene. My father checking his watch, the desk where Grandpa used to sit. The room still smelled faintly of his aftershave. I turned and walked out. Upstairs, I packed what I could fit into 2 suitcases. Everything else, furniture keepsakes, books I'd grown up with, I'd have to leave behind. Around noon, I heard voices downstairs. I opened the door to find 2 uniformed men speaking with David near the front hall. These gentlemen are from estate security, he said when he noticed me. They'll be handling the property transition. You brought security to escort me out, I asked. Standard precaution, he replied. Nothing personal. A locksmith had already started working on the front door. The clicking of tools against metal echoed through the house. I kept my voice steady. Are you really changing the locks already? Naturally, he said, glancing at his phone. The property holds company documents and assets. I can't risk liability. He turned back to the guards. How much longer will this take? I've got back-to-back calls this afternoon. One of the guards stepped forward to help carry my bags. He didn't meet my eyes, but his voice was kind. Where should we load these, miss? I walked down the staircase, slowly touching the banister I used to slide down as a child. The wall still had faint pencil marks from where Grandpa used to measure my height. I passed the reading corner, where we'd sat for hours, him with his glasses and a dog-eared paperback me curled beside him with a notebook of questions. David stood by the door, keys in hand. Is that everything he asked? Not unkindly, just impatient? I nodded. Good. Our attorneys will be in touch if there are any remaining forms to sign. He extended his hand toward me like he was finishing a business meeting. I looked at it, then walked past him and out the door without saying a word. The guard who carried my bags nodded once before closing the trunk of my car. I'm sorry, miss, he said quietly. I drove to a small place called the Maple Ridge Inn, an older hotel near the lake with decent weekly rates and clean enough rooms. The front desk clerk barely looked up when I checked in. My room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and had a view of the parking lot. I took my grandmother's crocheted afghan from my bag and laid it over the bedspread, trying to make the space feel less empty. That evening I sat by the window and let the silence settle around me. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't answer any of the messages on my phone. The grief hit slowly, not just for Henry, but for the house, the family I thought I had, and the version of my father I kept hoping would appear. I stayed like that for a long time. Then I finally got up, washed my face, and started to unpack. The next morning came too early. The hotel light was harsh, and my back ached from the thin mattress. I checked my phone. No new messages, just a few from friends who had been at the funeral offering short condolences. I didn't reply. By mid-morning, I'd called Angela, my old roommate from college, who now lived 20 minutes away. "Can I stay with you a few days?" I asked. "Just until I figure out my next steps." She didn't hesitate. "Of course. Come whenever." Before leaving the hotel, I sat on the edge of the bed and scrolled through apartment listings on my phone. The prices shocked me. Even the most basic one-bedroom places were higher than I remembered. I'd lost most of my clients while taking care of Grandpa, and rebuilding my business wasn't going to happen overnight. The future stretched out in front of me, wide and uncertain. Just after lunch, my phone rang again, this time from a number I didn't recognize. I nearly let it go to voicemail, but something in me said to pick up. "Miss Linwood," a woman asked. "This is Patricia with Harold Jenkins's office. Mr. Jenkins would like to speak with you today if you're available. It's regarding your grandfather's estate." I sat up straight. "Did he say what it's about?" "Only that it's urgent. We scheduled a 300 appointment." I hung up and sat still for a long time. Maybe there was something Harold hadn't read aloud. A letter, a keepsake, some final message. The law office was downtown in a red brick building I'd driven past 100 times but never entered. The receptionist led me back to Harold's office immediately. He stood when I walked in. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the seat across from his desk. "I expect the last day has been difficult." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He opened a leather folder and glanced down at the document inside. "Did your father review the entire will after yesterday's reading?" he asked. "No," I said. "He asked for a summary." A small smile tugged at the edge of Harold's mouth. "That's what I thought." He turned a page and slid it toward me. "There were conditions," he said, "on your father's inheritance." And just like that, the silence in the room changed. Something was shifting. Harold slid the document across the desk, tapping his index finger against the page. "Your grandfather's bequest to your father came with very specific conditions," he said, "one of which, as of this morning, has been violated." I stared down at the page. Legal language filled every line, clauses, subclauses, numbered footnotes. But Harold flipped to a section already marked with a yellow tab. He cleared his throat gently and read aloud, "The inheritance granted to David. Richard Linwood is contingent upon his ongoing provision of housing, financial support, and medical coverage for my granddaughter, Mara Elaine Linwood, including residence in the family home and a monthly stipend for her independent well-being." I blinked. He evicted me less than 24 hours after the will was read. Harold didn't react. He simply nodded once. "Yes, which means your father has defaulted on the terms, and as per the contingency clause, the entire estate, including the company home and assets, now transfers to you." I couldn't speak. My hands curled slightly against the arms of the chair. Henry anticipated that David might act impulsively. Harold continued removing his glasses. "We spent months drafting this language. He wanted to give his son a chance to do the right thing, one final opportunity. But he also wanted to ensure you would be protected if things went as he expected." I sat back slowly. "He never told me." "He didn't want you to worry," Harold said. His words exactly. For a moment, the office fell quiet, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the HVAC above us. I glanced out the window where downtown traffic moved like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. Harold leaned forward again. "There's more," he said, reaching for a smaller folder beneath the legal documents. "Your grandfather left letters for both you and your father, as well as video messages. He requested that the two of you view them together with me present." "Together," I asked. "He was very clear on that point," Harold said. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock here in this office." I nodded slowly, still trying to take in the shift. I'd left that house with 2 suitcases and a broken heart. Now I was being told I owned everything my father had spent years waiting for. Harold reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a card. "This is the estate's private security firm," he said. "They're already aware of the change in ownership. If you'd like to have the locks changed today, you're within your rights." My fingers brushed the edge of the card. "You really think he'll still be there?" Harold gave a measured pause. "I suspect he believes none of this will hold. Not until he hears it from me." I left the office in a daze, walking to my car, as if I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. The air felt different, lighter somehow. I sat behind the wheel and called Angela to cancel my stay. "I'll explain everything later," I told her. Things turned around. The estate security firm agreed to meet me at the house at 5. I arrived a few minutes before them, pulling into the same gravel curve where I'd parked nearly every day for the past year. My father's car was still out front. The porch light had been left on, though the sun hadn't yet dipped below the treetops. 3 uniformed officers arrived on schedule. I showed them the ownership paperwork Harold had prepared. The lead officer, a man named Cole, read every word carefully, then nodded. "We'll handle the lock replacements and update the alarm codes, but you'll need to inform the current occupant." "I know," I said. "I'll take care of it." I knocked on the front door, the same one I'd walked through 1,000 times. My father opened it, phone in hand, his expression neutral until he saw the officers standing behind me. "What's going on?" he asked. "There's been a change," I said. "You'll want to speak to Harold." He stepped aside as we came in. The security team moved through the house with professional ease, checking entrances, testing the alarm system, preparing to update the controls. David followed me into the study. "Explain yourself." I turned to face him. "Grandpa's will had a condition. You were supposed to provide for me. That included letting me stay here. When you kicked me out, you triggered the forfeiture clause." He stared at me, then laughed once, short and sharp. "That's absurd. Harold didn't mention anything like that yesterday." "You didn't let him finish," I said. "You told him to send you a summary." My father's face began to pale. He opened his mouth to argue, but the lead security officer stepped in. "Excuse me, Ms. Linwood. The lock replacements are complete. Where would you like the new keys delivered?" I held out my hand. "Right here is fine." David stood frozen for a moment. Then he turned, walked to the hallway, and picked up his phone again. "You can't do this," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I didn't do it," I replied. "You did." As I walked him to the door, his shoulders looked different, smaller somehow, less certain. The man who had smiled across the desk just yesterday had been replaced by someone searching for a foothold that no longer existed. At 10 the next morning, I arrived early to Harold's office. The conference room was set for 3, a laptop already connected to a monitor. Harold greeted me with a quiet nod. "He'll be here," he said. "You ready?" I nodded. Just before 10, the door opened. David stepped in, followed by a sharply dressed man he introduced as his attorney, Mark Carlton. The 2 sat opposite me at the table. My father didn't meet my eyes. "This isn't a negotiation," Harold said calmly. "It's the execution of Henry Linwood's final wishes. You're here as a witness." He dimmed the lights and pressed play on the laptop. The screen flickered, and there was Grandpa sitting in the leather chair by his fireplace, a glass of water on the table beside him. He looked older than I remembered, but clear-eyed, intent. "To my son David," he began. "If you're watching this, then you've made the choice I feared you would." He spoke plainly without venom. "You always chase the surface of things, money, titles, position, but never the meaning underneath. I gave you one last test, one chance to treat Mara with the dignity she deserves. You failed that test." The room was silent. "You always valued the company more than the people in it," Grandpa continued. "But Linwood Construction was built on trust, not just timber. If you can't honor that, you don't deserve it." When the screen faded to black, Harold cued the second message. Grandpa appeared again this time with a softer look in his eyes. "Mara," he said, "if you're watching this, then things have gone as I expected. I'm sorry for the pain it took to get here, but I want you to know you are ready. I've watched how you care, how you lead, how you listen. That's what this business needs now, not just strategy, but soul." He paused, then held up a photo of me at age 5, sitting in his lap, laughing with my arms around his neck. "You were the best thing your mother ever gave me," he said quietly, "and the greatest gift I could leave this world is putting the future in your hands." The video ended. No one spoke. The room held its breath. Harold switched the lights back on. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll begin the formal transfer. Mara, the estate and business are yours." I turned toward my father. He didn't say a word, but the look on his face said everything. The night after the video messages, I slept in my old bedroom, even though the master suite was now mine. I wasn't ready to make that change yet. The air still smelled faintly of Henry's aftershave, and his slippers were tucked neatly under the edge of the bed untouched since the last time he wore them. I left them there. Morning came with a flood of emails and missed calls. Most were from people I didn't know well. Contractors, executives, community leaders, all trying to adjust to the shift in ownership. Some messages were warm, others formal, a few almost suspicious. I made coffee and opened my grandfather's planner, flipping to the page where he'd once scribbled, "Start with what matters most." That became my anchor. The first few days moved fast. I sat with department heads, reviewed pending contracts, and started learning how the company operated beyond what I'd overheard growing up. Everyone knew who I was, but no one knew what to expect. I didn't pretend to have all the answers. I asked questions, listened, and took notes. Exactly 1 week after the will meeting, my father showed up unannounced. I saw his car pull into the driveway from the upstairs window. He was holding a bottle of wine and wore a navy blazer like it was still his house. I opened the door without inviting him in. "Can we talk?" he asked, "just the two of us." I led him to the living room but left the wine on the side table unopened. He sat forward on the couch, elbows on his knees. "I've had a lot to think about," he began. "Your grandfather's message, it hit me harder than I expected." He looked around the room, pausing on a framed photo of the two of us from years ago. "Maybe I've been too focused on the company. Maybe I lost sight of the bigger picture." I didn't respond. I wanted to hear what he really came to say. He cleared his throat. "I want to be part of things again. I want a chance to rebuild, to be your father, to help guide the company. I can offer experience connections. We don't have to do this separately." I kept my tone even. This can't be about control. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, it needs to start outside the company. His expression shifted just slightly. "Of course," he said quickly. "That makes sense. We could start with dinner, just the two of us, no shop talk." But within minutes, the conversation circled back to business. He brought up the Jefferson project, Linwood Construction's biggest active contract. "That deal is delicate," he said. "I've spent years building trust with that team. One misstep and we risk losing it." "It's already handled," I told him. I met with Robert Jefferson on Monday. We've adjusted the payment schedule to fit their fiscal year, and the timeline's been extended 3 weeks. His eyes widened. "He met with you face to face," I said. "He prefers relationships over hard numbers." I made sure he understood that hasn't changed. He didn't argue, but the silence that followed said everything. Over the next 2 weeks, my father tried different angles. Sometimes he arrived with a friendly tone, bringing old photo albums and pointing out stories I barely remembered. Other times he dropped names of former clients or tried to invite himself to meetings. He even brought a retired project manager by one morning saying, "Thought we could talk strategy with someone who's been through it all." I was polite but firm. Every time he veered toward business, I redirected. Every time he hinted at stepping in, I drew the line. In the background, I continued to learn. My marketing background helped more than I expected. especially with updating the company's digital presence and client communications. Some of the executives began looping me in earlier on decisions. I kept my focus tight one day at a time. Then came the foundation idea. It had started as a half-formed thought, something Henry and I once talked about during one of his better days. People forget about trades, he had said. College isn't the only way forward. I called it the Henry Linwood Foundation. Its mission was simple: provide scholarships and mentorship for underprivileged young people interested in trades, plumbing, electrical, carpentry. I brought the proposal to the board, and to my surprise, it passed without a single objection. The launch event was modest but well attended. Local press showed up, as did a few former employees who had gotten their start, thanks to Henry's willingness to give people a chance. I gave a short speech, then stood with a group of scholarship recipients for photos. My father showed up near the end. He hadn't been invited, but no one stopped him. He lingered near the refreshments, shaking hands, smiling for pictures. When he approached me at the bar, he lifted a glass and said, "Clever move. Good press." "It's not about press," I said. "It's about values." He watched me for a long moment. "You really believe that, don't you? That a business can be more than just the bottom line?" "I do." And so did Henry. For the first time since the reading of the will, his face softened, not with defeat, but something closer to understanding. "He left you more than the title," he said quietly. "He left you the lens he saw the world through." I nodded. "And that's worth more than the company." He didn't argue. He finished his drink, gave a small nod, and left without asking for anything. 3 weeks later, I made a decision. I called Harold and told him I wanted to create a modest trust for my father. Nothing extravagant, but enough for him to live comfortably without needing access to the company. Harold was cautious but supportive. "Just make sure he understands it's a gift, not a negotiation." When my father learned about the trust, he didn't push back. In fact, he thanked me with more grace than I expected. Our next meeting was quiet, almost easy. He talked about his own childhood stories about Henry I'd never heard. They weren't all flattering, but they were real, the way you speak when you finally stop performing. Something between us had shifted. It wasn't repaired, but it was human. 3 months into the transition, I finally felt like I had my footing. I wasn't just answering questions. I was leading meetings, making decisions, fielding concerns from the field teams. Linwood Construction was no longer Henry's company run in his absence. It was mine now, and the staff began to treat it that way. By late spring, I'd finalized a few strategic hires and approved a reorganization plan for one of our more outdated divisions. The foundation was gaining attention, too. Several local trade schools had reached out to partner, and our first group of scholarship recipients had started classes. There was still so much to learn, but every day felt more settled than the last. My father hadn't visited in nearly a month when his name appeared again in my assistant's calendar notes. He wanted to meet no surprise there, but this time the message said he'd bring lunch and keep it casual. I agreed to a short visit the following Wednesday. True to his word, he arrived with sandwiches and bottled tea. No briefcase, no printed proposals, just a pressed shirt and a slightly nervous smile. We sat on the back patio under the shade of the old maple tree. For the first few minutes, we talked about the weather, then about how the company's trucks were being wrapped with new branding. He asked questions, listened, and didn't interrupt. It was the most neutral exchange we'd had in years. Then, near the end of the meal, he pulled out a small folder from his bag. "I've been working on something," he said, sliding it across the table. "It's not official, but I'd love your feedback." Inside were handwritten notes and a loose proposal ideas for a new apprenticeship program that could be layered into the foundation. It wasn't polished, but it was thoughtful. He'd outlined ways to mentor students beyond the scholarship phase and included ideas for pairing them with retired professionals as life coaches. I flipped through the pages slowly, then looked up. "Did you write all this?" He nodded. "I've been thinking about what Henry said, about how I chase the surface of things. Maybe I did, but I want to contribute something meaningful now, even if I'm not in charge. We didn't decide anything that day, but I told him I'd consider it. As he left, he said, 'No pressure, Mara. Whatever you decide, I respect it.'" The next few days, I kept returning to the notes. They were good. The plan still needed structure and budget review, but the heart of it made sense. After a long talk with the foundation director, we agreed to pilot a version of it with limited scope. I called my father that evening and told him the idea would move forward under my oversight. "Thank you," he said. "That means more than you know." The following month, we held a small gathering at a renovated warehouse that now served as the Foundation's first hands-on training site. We invited Press City officials and company veterans. I gave a short speech thanking the community and naming the new program the Second Frame Initiative, a nod to the idea that building something worthwhile often requires starting again, this time with more care. My father stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets. He didn't speak, didn't pose for pictures, just stood there quietly watching the students interact with their new mentors. When we locked eyes, he gave a short nod, then turned to leave. I followed him outside. "You did well today," he said. I crossed my arms lightly. I meant what I said about the name. It's not just about the kids. "I know," he said. "It's about all of us." There was a pause. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim envelope. "Henry wrote me a second letter, one I didn't mention before. He said I should give it to you only when I felt like I understood what it meant." He handed it to me and stepped back. "I think I finally do." That night I read the letter alone in my study. It wasn't long, just a single page in Henry's familiar handwriting. He wrote about regret, about the weight of silence between generations, and about the hope that someday David might step forward without needing a spotlight. And if he does, the letter ended, "Let him help, but only if his help doesn't come at the cost of your peace." The words stayed with me. They still do. In the weeks that followed, I allowed him to join advisory calls with the Foundation's leadership. He spoke when asked and listened when he wasn't. There were no interruptions, no overreaches. When board members challenged his ideas, he didn't bristle, he adjusted. Slowly, the people around him began to lower their guard. At home, our dynamic stayed careful but warmer. He helped with small repairs around the property and sometimes stopped by just to bring groceries or ask how I was doing. Once he brought me an old family photo. I'd never seen my mom, barely 20, standing on the roof of one of Henry's earliest job sites with a hard hat and a wide grin. I framed it and set it on the mantel. Still, I kept boundaries in place. The company remained solely mine. The Foundation had its own checks and balances. I made no promises beyond what had already been given. Then one Friday afternoon, Harold stopped by the office unannounced. "Just came from a meeting with your father," he said as he sat down. "He's asked that his name be removed from the pending proposal to rejoin Linwood Construction in any formal capacity." I looked at Harold surprised. "He's been patient lately. I thought he might ask to be reinstated on the board." "He said he doesn't want to muddy the waters," Harold replied. "Said you've built something stable and he doesn't want to be the reason it tips." I sat with that for a long time, not because I was upset, but because I knew what it took for him to say it. The shift between us wasn't sudden. It didn't come with one apology or a grand gesture. It came through quiet moments, a folder of notes, a single envelope, a repaired gate, a photo placed gently in my hands. And it reminded me of something Henry had said in the garden one spring afternoon. The best growth happens when no one's watching. By the end of summer, the Second Frame Initiative was fully funded for the next 2 years. We expanded partnerships with 2 more trade schools and had a wait list for the next round of students. My father came to the quarterly check-in, sat in the back, and left without needing a single acknowledgement. The peace wasn't perfect, but it was real. The following March, the city hosted its annual Construction Futures Expo, an event where firms, trade schools, and nonprofits came together to showcase opportunities for young workers. Linwood Construction had a modest booth near the back, but this year the spotlight was on the foundation's Second Frame initiative. I'd asked 2 of our scholarship recipients to speak on a youth panel. They were nervous, but they did great. After their session, I stood off to the side, watching attendees browse our table, flipping through pamphlets and asking questions. A woman in a gray blazer came over and introduced herself as Camille, a program coordinator from the Department of Labor. "We've been following your foundation's growth," she said. "Would you ever consider applying for federal partnership status?" I blinked. "Federal." She nodded. "Your model checks a lot of boxes: education, workforce development, mentoring. If you're interested, I can send a contact from our regional office." That night I called Harold. We'd never aimed for anything beyond local reach, but after a long conversation, we agreed to start the process. I didn't say anything to my father until we knew it was more than just a conversation. In April, we were invited to submit a full proposal. The package was detailed budgets, metrics, long-term plans, but the most important part was the origin story. The reviewers wanted to understand the why behind it all. I stayed late one night writing the draft narrative, pulling from Henry's letters and the mission we'd carried forward. I included the students, the mentors, and yes, even my father. I wrote about his second chance ideas, how he offered input but no demands, and how that quiet shift had helped build trust where it had once been lost. The final application went in by early May. We didn't hear back for a while. Work picked up, and life kept moving. One afternoon, while driving back from a job site in the northern part of the county, I noticed something out of place. It was an old shed, collapsed on one side, on a stretch of land I hadn't thought about in years. I pulled over. That lot had belonged to my grandfather long before the company grew. Henry used to bring me there when I was little, back when it was just a flat piece of dry earth and a few fence posts. He'd called it the original blueprint. Standing there now, weeds curling around my boots, I realized it had never been sold. Later that week, I brought it up to Harold. "Could we buy the land from the estate?" I asked. He gave me a puzzled look. "Mara, it already passed to you. Henry put it in your name the month before he died." I sat back. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" He smiled. "It wasn't relevant. Until now." That weekend, I went out there with a thermos of coffee and a fold-up chair. I sat in the middle of the field as the sun dipped behind the trees and thought about what I wanted to build next. Not a building, not another foundation branch. Something different. A few weeks later, I invited my father to lunch. We met at a quiet cafe off a side street downtown. I didn't bring any folders, no laptop, just a small envelope I'd been holding on to for a while. He looked at it puzzled. "What's this?" "It's from Henry," I said. "But it's not for you, it's for me, and I think I'm ready to tell you what it said." We sat there, tea growing cold between us, as I told him what Henry had written. About how he saw the family struggle coming, about his decision to trust me with the business, not because I was perfect, but because I knew how to rebuild, and about how he'd hoped my father might one day be strong enough to support without leading. My father didn't interrupt. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "I wish he'd told me that himself," he said quietly. "I think he did," I replied. "Just not with words you were ready to hear at the time." He nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right." When I got back to the office that afternoon, Camille's name was waiting in my inbox. We'd been approved. Second Frame was officially recognized as a national workforce development partner. Funding would expand over the next 3 years, and our reach could grow to 3 neighboring states. I read the email twice, then again. It wasn't just a win for the foundation, it was a moment I hadn't dared to imagine back when this started. I called Harold, then the program director, then my assistant, to help schedule next steps. Then I sat alone for a while. That night I walked out to the old property mine, now officially and legally, and watched the dusk settle over the field. For a long time, I stood where the old fence line used to be, remembering a day when Henry let me carry the measuring tape, pretending I was the one marking the land. I smiled and whispered, "This is still ours." But I also knew the next frame was mine to design. The morning after I stood on that old lot, I brought a small crew from the foundation to walk it with me. The fence line was gone, but the shape of the place held. We paced the length, imagining workbenches, tool sheds, and a safe space where students could practice without fear of getting it wrong. By the end of the week, the plans had a name, the Linwood Yard. We kept it simple. No grand building, just an open-air yard with covered stations, lockable cabinets, and a chalkboard wall for sketches. The first class met there in late summer, a dozen young people in borrowed work boots, tracing framing squares like musicians learning scales. I stood back and watched the mentors show them how to hold a level to the light until the bubble centered. David came to the opening without asking for a role. He stood near the gate with his hands in his pockets, nodding as the students tried their first joints. When one of them dropped a tape measure and looked embarrassed, he picked it up and showed the trick Henry taught us both. Hook the tab with your thumb, let the tape slide, don't fight it. He didn't look around for a camera. He didn't need thanks. He just helped, then stepped aside. That fall, Camille's office sent notice that Second Frame's federal partnership had cleared its final review. It meant stability we could count on, and room to reach farther than our county line. We added 2 satellite workshops and a quiet scholarship fund for older adults changing careers. The emails that moved me most were from graduates sending pictures of first paychecks and first toolboxes with their names etched on the lid. At the company, steadiness replaced guessing. I kept Henry's planner on my desk and opened to the same line every Monday start with what matters most. Some days that meant a job site visit before sunrise. Other days it meant a conversation no one wanted to have. When the board asked if I'd consider bringing David back in a formal capacity, I said not yet. He agreed. We stayed on the path we'd chosen, close enough to talk, far enough to keep the work clean. 2 years to the day after Henry died, I took roses to his grave at the small cemetery on the hill. The sky was that clear New England blue he loved, and the air held the edge of fall. I told him about the yard, the students, the way the company had settled. I told him his slippers were still under the bed, and I wasn't ready to move them. Then I stood quiet and let the wind do the rest. On the way home, I stopped by the yard. A class was just packing up. One of the students showed me a frame they'd built and said, "It's not perfect, but it's square." I smiled and said that's how most good things begin. David was there again, wiping dust from a saw table unnoticed and content. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I used to think justice would feel like a verdict. It doesn't. It feels like a door you learn to close gently, then open when the light changes. It looks like a table with more seats and a company led by the values that built it. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it cleared enough space for better work. And kindness, steady, boundaried, ordinary kindness, gave us a future. If you've listened this far, thank you for keeping me company. If any part of this reminded you of your own turning point, I'd love to hear it. Tell me where you're listening from, share your story if you're willing, and stay with us for the next one.